What's up everyone out there? Welcome back to another addicted fishing tutorial. My name is Jordan Carnegie and today we're talking about how to use twitching jigs to catch Chinook salmon and then primarily the addicted tailout twitcher. So if you guys want to learn more about how to use this fun method, stay tuned. It's coming at you right now. Got one. Got him. There he is, guys. So twitching for Chinook salmon isn't something that's very mainstream. It's something we've talked a lot about here at Addicted Fishing, but haven't really showed you guys much of. And in particular, we actually designed our certain jigs to really target these kind of fish, being that they're bigger, they're more flamboyant and bright, and they get down into the strike zone where these big Chinook like to live. The first thing I'm gonna start off with is talking about our rod selection. What I have here is an Okuma Guide Select twitching rod. This is a 7.5-foot rod, it's 8 to 15 pounds, and it has a very stiff action. And having that backbone, yet somewhat of a soft tip, is very crucial when choosing a twitching rod. There's a lot of different manufacturers of twitching rods out there, but I wouldn't sacrifice a light rod for a durable and a heavy rod like this here. This is a 7.5-foot rod, and again, that 8 to 15 pound rating is really necessary. You don't want to get too much heavier or too much lighter because you really won't be able to feel the contact of your jig, which we'll explain more as we go throughout fishing today. I have a 30 series reel on here. Any 3000 or 4000 series reel of any brand will work great. I love my Okumas, and what I have on here, what I have this lined with, is the 30-pound Addicted Enforcer braided line, and this is probably the most crucial part to this setup. I do not ever like to twitch with any sort of monofilament or fluorocarbon line because it has stretch to it. You want to be able to feel the sensitivity and the direct contact to your jig, especially these big jigs, so that you're not getting snagged up on the bottom, and two, so that you know when that fish bites. Having that 30-pound line rating can be very crucial because it cuts through the water nicely. We'll explain a lot of that today, but we're going to be fishing a lot of fast water and a lot of deep water pockets trying to target these Chinook in a moving river like we have here behind us, which having that 30-pound braid that cuts through the water nicely is going to be imperative for allowing you to get in front of those fish properly. At the end of my 30-pound braid, I've connected a 20-pound fluorocarbon bumper with a blood knot. Any kind of uni knot, blood knot, or crazy Alberto knot will work great for connecting these two lines, but you want to use something that's very strong and that holds that 20-pound fluoro to that 30-pound and doesn't allow it to bust off at that knot. That's very important because you don't want to be losing these expensive lures. I've used about 4.5 to 5 foot of this fluorocarbon line, and I like to use at least 4 to 6 feet so that you get that jig away from that high vis line. A lot of times it won't matter, but in certain situations where you have clear water or high pressure, you want to get your presentation away from that high vis line. But the benefit of that high vis line is you can see exactly where it is and work the structure that's in front of you. So it's imperative to have both. Getting down to the business end of the operation, the actual jig, is something that we can talk about forever. There's all kinds of these tailout twitcher colors that we've personally designed to try to catch and target certain species like these Chinook. And in particular, we've gone and added a lot more weight than most jig manufacturers to these jigs. And what I mean specifically by that is our 1 ounce twitching jigs and our 3/4 ounce. The reason we designed these jigs so heavily is to specifically target these Chinook species, again, in deep, boily, and fast water. We're gonna step into the river here in just a second and show you guys exactly the presentations you wanna use in this kind of scenario, but going with that 3/4 ounce jig or that 1 ounce jig is gonna keep you in that strike zone longer and allow you to catch more fish ultimately. Choosing your color of jig is something that comes down to almost personal preference. I have my favorite colors that I know work, but also I've caught fish on almost every single one of these jig colors that we have. You see my jig box here, this is my Chinook box. We got the Pop-Off Special. This is a very flamboyant, bright, and aggressive color. You have your typical classic pinks with the white head. You got your pinks and purples. You got your Nightmare, which is my personal favorite. You have the Blurple. You got blue and purple, and you can see how I have the full range of colors here. I don't go to the river with just one jig or just one color of jig. I have my personal favorites, which are probably more towards the pinks and that Nightmare color, but I fish a lot of dirtier water. So depending on what kind of river you're fishing, you want to go with different colors of jigs. If you're in the clearer water, you want to go with more neutral colors, like those blues and like those purples and like those pinks. And if you're in very silty and dirty water, you want to go with colors that are very flamboyant or very dark, like the Seahawk color here, or the Nightmare color, which is a very dark and big presentation, or the Black and Chartreuse, which is a big profile. And when you're fishing that dirty water, it gives off more size and it gives off more profile. That way those fish can see it easier. Choosing the jig size is really going to depend on what type of water that you're fishing. If you're fishing any water from 8 to 15 feet deep, you're going to want to use one of the 1 ounce twitchers. And I'm going to show you guys by example here as we go along through the day why we want that 1 ounce in that deep water, because it gets down to the bottom quicker, obviously, and it stays down there. But it takes a special technique to keep it down there in that strike zone. If you're fishing any sort of fast water or anything under 10 feet, you want to go with the 3/4 ounce. That way you can quickly move it through the structure without dropping that jig to the bottom and ultimately snagging up every time and losing that valuable jig. So let's step into the river here, let's start fishing, and let's show you guys exactly how to use these jigs. So the jig I've selected to fish this hole here behind me is a 3/4 ounce. I have a fast moving run. It's not super deep. It's only about 8 to 10. So I'm gonna go with 3/4 instead of 1 ounce so that I can effectively fish that through there a little bit slower. We're gonna fish runs here soon in just a little bit that are gonna be very deep, and I'm gonna want that 1 ounce, and you guys will see the difference why. So the hole we're gonna start with fishing today, we're gonna fish a lot of different types of water for you guys today and show you the technique you wanna use for them. Hopefully we'll hook one along the way, but if not, you're still gonna learn a lot today. What we have behind me is not your typical twitching run. A lot of times when people think twitching jigs, they're thinking slow, stagnant pools of water. That's not the case with these Chinook salmon. These fish are coming a long ways, they're hiding down in deep, cold water, and a lot of times they'll sacrifice that deep water for cold water and water with oxygen. So days like today, it's a nice cool day, we have a lot of cloud cover, these fish are gonna be up and in the riffles. They're not as worried about their protection, they need oxygen because they're traveling through the river, so they'll be in these fast water slots like this. The key to this is fishing this stuff effectively and breaking it down mathematically and actually working the structure that you have. We're not just casting into the pool and twitching it back. I'm almost fishing this like a spinner presentation where I'm working it in behind the rocks and moving through the structure. So having a good pair of glasses or something that helps you see through the water can be really imperative for keeping your jigs. One rule of thumb I'm going to talk about right away when we start fishing here is if you're ever fishing moving water and you're casting upriver at a 45-degree angle, you're always going to be reeling while you're twitching. Opposite that of if you're casting downriver in a moving spot, you're almost never going to be reeling. So this is what I mean by this. Let me demonstrate. So if I'm casting up, I see this big boulder here ahead of me. I'm going to let that sink for about a 3 count, and I'm going to start jigging, doing a short motion from my waist to my eyeballs, and after every single jig, I'm reeling about 2 to 3 times, or 1 full rotation. You can see I'm only reeling that reel 1 full rotation each time. I'm not reeling and jigging all at the same time. I'm jigging, letting it fall, reeling a full rotation, jigging, letting it fall, reeling a full rotation, because those fish want to see that thing going down in front of them. It keys into their natural predatory instinct to hit something that's falling in front of them, something that's dying. That's how they've survived in the ocean for all these years, and as they come back in, they see that same motion and they think to kill. So what I mean by that again is as I cast up, I'm going to let that sink all the way to the bottom. I'm going to jig, let it fall, reel, jig, let it fall, reel, jig, let it fall, reel. And you notice I didn't let that thing sink all the way to the bottom at first. That's a great way to lose your jig. What I like to do is start my presentation and let it work down to the bottom, waiting to feel that bottom as I'm doing my jigging motion. So as I work my cast downriver, when I start in a run, whether I'm in my boat or I'm on the bank, I'm going to start at the top of the hole and I'm going to take 2 steps down through the run and change the direction of my cast each time. A lot of times with fish, it can be just the angle that's making them bite. So as I'm starting to work my way down here, I'm going to cast straight out at 90. I'm going to let that fall all the way to the bottom. I'm going to jig, let it reel, jig, let it fall, reel once, jig, let it fall, reel once, jig. And you can see how short and sweet my motion, oh, nailed that bird. You can see how short and sweet my motion is here. I'm not whipping this all the way up to my head. I'm not giving it a big jerk, because what's happening is with the current, you have resistance against your line. And against that resistance is your jig. So every time you lift 6 inches, your jig is going a foot. So use that theory to understand how much your jig is moving through the strike zone as you're bringing it across the river. Because what you don't want is that jig moving too far up. I want it to be going up 6 inches, falling a foot. Going up 6 inches, falling a foot. Instead of going up 3, falling 6. Going up 3, falling 6. Because after that series of jigging, your jig's gonna be all the way up 6 inches under the surface and not down in the strike zone where you expect it to be. So I'm gonna cast back out here at 90. I'm gonna let that fall. I'm gonna jig, 1 reel, jig, 1 reel. And you can see how I'm giving a very aggressive, very short and sweet jigging motion, but I'm making that thing move every time. I'm coming in contact, and then I'm letting that line lay flat on the water so it's falling back down in front of those fish's face. And this can be the very hardest technique to perfect in moving water like this. So as I start to transverse my cast downriver more and I start casting downriver at about 45 degrees, I'm gonna reel less. Contrary to where I was casting upriver, I was having to reel after every single jig. As I cast downriver, the current is taking my line and my jig, resisting me from going to the bottom. So as you see here, I've fished this entire presentation so far because I casted downriver and I never reeled once. That jig is going out there, it's staying in the strike zone and is jumping up and down all the way across the river rather than falling, getting pulled against the current and jumping towards the surface. Again, pulling you out of the strike zone and away from those fish. So a little recap. As you cast upriver when you start your cast, you want to reel every single time after you jig on the way down. And then once you pass 90 degrees across from you as you cast, you want to not reel after every jig. You want to feather that thing through, jigging, leaving that thing right near the bottom and letting the current keep you off the bottom rather than the tension from your reeling. So as I'm trying to effectively fish a hole, it's imperative to keep moving. You don't want to stand in one spot at the top of the hole and keep casting behind the same rock every time. So I started upriver. I've made about 2 or 3 steps all the way down and moved my boat all the way down after about every 3 or 4 casts, casting in that same direction and swinging it through almost like a spinner presentation. I want to effectively cover the water. This is a very, very great way to cover a lot of water in a quick amount of time, and that's the beauty of it. You get a good reaction from the fish. They usually bite quickly if they're there, and that's really the thing about the springers. More so than using the right color, using the right presentation or the right strategy, it's more about them being there in front of you. So as I've worked my way down, my presentation is going to change. I started up in the faster water where I was needing to cast more at a 45-degree upriver to get this thing to sink down. And now that I'm working my way in towards the tail out, the river's slowing down. It's starting to come into this nice tail. It's getting a nice bubble line and it's getting a little bit deeper. So in that case, I'm only gonna make a cast 90 degrees to the bank and not so much upriver because I want this thing to fall and I wanna be able to swing it across the tail out and get that proper presentation. So I'm gonna go across here. And here I'm actually gonna let it sink. I know there's not a lot of big structure. I know there's no big boulders. I'm gonna let that fall for about a 3/1000. I felt it hit the bottom with a big thump. I keep my rod tip high and I'm gonna start using this jigging motion. And as I'm jigging, I need to be making sure that I'm making contact with that jig every single time. And if I go to jig again and I feel nothing but slack, you're either 1, on bottom, or 2, a fish might have that jig. So you need to be reeling to counteract that so that you can keep that sensitivity. The easiest way to figure out if your jig hits the bottom is with this technique right here. A lot of people just let it fall and try to guess how deep the water is. I know out in front of me is about 8 feet deep, but the best way to be able to keep sensitivity and feel the bottom when you hit it is to keep your rod tip at a 45-degree angle, keep your line tight. You're gonna be able to see that line register as soon as it finally hits bottom. You'll watch it, and then you'll see it go thump. And now once you've come in contact with the bottom in a spot like this, it's imperative to keep it down there. So I'm gonna reel only the amount that I have to. I'm not gonna insist on reeling every single time after I jig. A lot of times I'll make 3 jigs to every 1 reel so that that thing stays right down there in the strike zone and slowly moves through. Again, the hardest part of doing this for these Chinook is fishing the moving water. A lot of times we usually use these jigs again in very stagnant and still water. So getting that technique down where you can find the bottom and then keep it down there by making smaller jigging motions is going to be crucial to catching fish on this. Let's move downriver and find a new hole. Okay, so now what we have in front of us is much more of a typical twitching hole. We have all this water coming down. We're standing on an island right now in the middle of the river. We have a big swirly deep hole with a big foam line in the middle of it. The way I'm gonna start again is I'm gonna stand in one spot. I'm gonna start my cast going clockwise. I'm gonna start to the left and work my way into that deep hole and slowly work down the bubble line. These fish will nose up into these areas, kind of get stuck by the shallow water where they can't migrate much further, and then we can pinpoint them with these jigs down in this deep hole where most bobber setups or any kind of hardware setup is gonna be really hard to fish in this turbulent water. So the way I'm gonna start this is casting straight up river, let that fall, sink to the bottom, thump, there's my thump, jig, let it fall, jig, let it fall. But because this is stagnant water, I'm gonna absolutely need to reel after every single jig. I don't have that water current pulling against on my line that's gonna keep me up and off the bottom. So I'm gonna have to imperatively reel at least 1 to 2 times after every single time I jig. Now that I made that top cast, I'm gonna cast downriver a little bit further, let that fall, thump, there's the bottom, 1, reel once, jig, reel once, jig, reel once, jig. And you see how my jig in this particular instance is going slow to fast. I'm starting slow and I'm ending with a sharp jerk. That way that thing's getting that violent jump and then falling straight down once I let that line go slack the way I am. So jig, reel, let it fall. Jig, reel, let it fall. Slowly keep working my way down here. Okay, so I've worked my way clockwise out of that top swirl, and now I'm back down into the tail out, so my strategy is gonna go right back to what we talked about before. I'm gonna be casting across the river at 90 degrees, letting it sink and swing, and then not reeling at all as I fish it through this bubble line here, just like so. So now that I have the current counteracting me and pulling against that braided line and the weight of that jig, I can fish almost half of my drift without jigging and reeling at the same time. Once I want to bring it in, I swing it across and I bring it back in, and I take 2 big steps down. All right, we've covered this whole top to bottom. Now let's go find some fast water and show you guys how to fish that. So now we've stepped downriver and we're in much more of an atypical style of run. You see here behind us, it's very shallow, only about 3 to 5 feet. The run has about a walking speed current going through it and much more of like a steelhead run. But more often than not, the Chinook love this kind of water. And using a twitching jig in this kind of water can really work to your advantage given using the right technique, which I'm about to show you. What I see here is I see this moving water. I have a lot of structure. I can see the structure I need to work. And so I'm going to visualize that. I'm not just going to blindly cast into the hole and jig it back, because that's either going to, 1, make me snag, or 2, I'm not going to be effectively fishing. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to step out a couple of steps, and I'm never, ever, ever in this kind of water going to cast above 90 degrees. So I'm never going to make an upriver cast here. I'm only going to cast at 90 and mostly at 45 so that I can immediately use that current and manipulate that current and swing my stuff through there while twitching. But my twitch itself is going to be much different than what we've been showing throughout this whole video. So what we're going to do, I'm going to take a couple steps out. I can see the drop off here. I have a ledge out in front of me. I have a nice steady current going across. And so I'm going to start right behind the first couple of boulders that I see. And the key to doing this is as soon as this lure hits the water, I want to close my bail and immediately pick up line and start twitching. My twitch repetition is going to be about 2 to 3 times faster than I've been doing so far, just like so. So I'm going to go straight across about 90 degrees, maybe a little bit less, and you can see already I'm twitching, reeling, twitching, reeling, twitching, reeling. And this is much more of like a spinner presentation. I want this to go through there quick. I don't want the fish to see it for a long time, but I want it to go around the structure that they're sitting behind and fall in front of their nose where they don't have a lot of time to think about it and react. They just bite. So now that I've done that, I'm going to cast downriver about another 5 to 10 feet. And again, very, very crucial doing this kind of stuff is that you're reeling at least 1 to 2 times after every single jig. As that thing comes down to 45 and gets below you, you can stop reeling quite as much, but you still need to pick up that repetition where you can see how I'm doing it here. It's more of a 4 count, like 1, 2, 3, 4, almost like you're writing music. I'm gonna go back across at 45, take 2 steps down, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'm just gonna keep that repetition going as I go through there. I'll feel it hitting bottom, I'll feel it sticking, but as it starts to hit bottom more, I just need to pick up my reeling a little bit more. And getting that calisthenic by lifting, falling, reel. Lifting, falling, reel is what's gonna be hardest for you guys, but it's the most important. Allowing that jig to still fall, even though you're in that fast current, is what is really crucial in getting that fish to bite. If it's just going up and up and up and up, that fish isn't gonna chase that presentation. It wants it going up and falling, and up and falling, and up and falling. But to give it that up and fall motion, we need to be doing it quicker so that we're not getting stuck on the bottom. So after I've made that cast, I'm gonna really work this method like I do when I teach a lot of spinner fishing. Close, middle, far, 2 steps. Close, middle, far, 2 steps. But in this case, I'm pretty much making the same distance cast every time. And after every cast though, I wanna take 2 steps downriver so that I can cover all the water in this whole boulder field with that twitching jig rather than standing in one spot and casting and casting. So be very repetitious with that. Cast the same distance, swing it through while jigging, take 2 steps. Cast that distance, swing it through while twitching, take 2 steps until you've worked your way all the way through the run. So I'm gonna be casting, I'm gonna go 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And if that helps you guys out there, I know a lot of when I'm teaching my clients a lot of the times, giving that cadence and giving that repetition and making some sort of song in your head on how to actually do that motion, like jig, reel twice, jig, reel twice, jig, reel twice, or that 1, 2, 3, 4 cadence as it goes through is gonna help you get that correct motion. And you can see again with how I'm jigging this, I'm doing very short, very sweet, but very aggressive jigs. I'm jigging it hard enough so that it comes up, but I'm not going above my eyeballs. I'm going from my belt to to my eyeballs with every single jig. And the main key is that I don't see that jig right up by the surface. So in this case, with this fast current, if I'm jigging too fast while reeling, you see how that jig never gets a chance to fall. But if I jig and let it fall, jig and let it fall, and reel in between each one of those cadences, that thing actually falls to the bottom every time rather than sitting right under the surface while it comes back in. So let's take 2 more steps down and keep working this run. So you can see how I'm still casting downriver to 45. Now that I'm getting into a little bit deeper water with a little heavier current, I can take my hand off and I'm just doing my jigging motion. If I go to jig and I feel it stick to a rock, I'm gonna reach down, I'm gonna bring in a couple reels of line. And I'm gonna keep using that current along with the drag from that line to fish that thing across. And it's not a bad thing to be hitting the bottom. You don't wanna be dragging the bottom where this is gonna slide into structure and get snagged, but you wanna keep it right down there on the bottom the whole time it's working through that fast water. All right, so now that we've covered 3 different styles of water with our 3/4 ounce, let's go find some deep boily water and put on our 1 ouncers. Okay, now we're in 1 ounce country. I've gone to the 1 ounce nightmare jig here, and mainly because we have clearer water. I'm not using a really flamboyant or really bright presentation. I've gone with that 1 ounce nightmare because mainly it's my favorite one. The reason I'm going to a 1 ounce jig here is because as you can see below us here, we have a fast moving run. It's over 10 feet deep and it has a lot of royals and boils pushing up off the bottom where a 3/4 ounce or a 1/2 ounce jig would never ever get down. It might, but we're gonna be so far through the strike zone by the time it does that we're not gonna effectively present to these fish. So the way I'm gonna work this hole is from top to bottom. Obviously I don't have a lot of bank to work with here, so my presentation will change as it goes down. Mainly I'm gonna start at a 45-degree angle up at the top. The riffle comes down, it drops off to about 6 to 10 to about 15 feet down here below me. And so I'm gonna start by fishing that 6-foot range, doing that faster jigging motion, again, like I taught earlier, as it's coming down river towards you, you need to be reeling after every single jig. So that's how I'm gonna start this. I go up at a 45-degree angle, and I'm not gonna necessarily rely on this thing hitting bottom before I start jigging when I cast upriver. Because using that angle and casting upriver, if you let it come down and into the series of rocks that are on the bottom, you're always gonna get snagged. So as it's coming down towards me, I'm gonna have to jig, let it fall, and reel at the same time. Jig, let it fall, reel at the same time. But as it passes 90 degrees into 45 and it's starting to get deeper, I'm getting into the part of the run where I don't need to be reeling at all. Actually, right now, I could even actually let some line out, but we'll talk more about that as we start coming across here and fishing this run. So I'm coming into the eddy here. I haven't reeled once since that line passed 90 degrees to the other bank, and I'm gonna bring it right back in, right under this lip. And so as I work in sequence down the river here, I made my first cast at 45. I'm gonna make my next cast at about 90, next cast at about 180, and then so on and so forth on down the line. Next cast I'm gonna do about 10 feet downriver, and as I'm casting more towards 90, I'm gonna wait for that to hit bottom now because I don't have that current pushing me into the rocks. And as soon as I start that thing, the thing about fishing the deeper holes, and especially with the 1 ounce, is a lot of the times you're not gonna need to reel at all, because you have so much depth to cover and you have so much drag on your line because of the current. You need to let that thing fall and get down deep and stay there. And if you reel each time after you jig, you're gonna constantly be working towards the surface and not be in front of those fish. Now that I've made that cast a little bit further down, I'm gonna go even further down, and I'm actually gonna wait until I feel bottom. Thump, there's my thump. I kept my line tight, kept my tip high to where I could see my line hit bottom. As it comes across, I'm gonna start making smaller and smaller jigging motions because again, the current and the line drag is pulling me up off that bottom. So I'm making small jigs. Even though I'm jigging this much, I bet that jig's moving about that far in the strike zone because of that drag. So now that I'm starting to cast at about a 45-degree downriver, it's gonna be very imperative that I let that thing hit the bottom. And even mid-cast. So I'm gonna jig this thing about 4 or 5 times here, and then I'm gonna wait and see if I can't feel bottom again. Thump, there it is again, and I'm gonna start jigging again. And you saw how much farther I had to let that thing fall again because of that tension from the line. So remembering that, and remembering that you have current, and remembering that you have drag against that lure, and using that mentality to keep it down in the zone by less jigging and less reeling will keep you in front of those fish, and it'll make you much more effective using these twitching jigs to catch salmon like this. Got one, got him. There he is, guys. So as I let that thing go through the strike zone, I just feathered it along. Got him, that's a nice one. Hey, So I cast it at that 45, I let that thing fall to the bottom, and I constantly just kept it going up and down, right in the strike zone, all the way across, and slam, he just nailed it. It's a wild. Well, there you have it, everybody. Using different presentations, different sizes of jigs, and fishing all different kinds of water that salmon live can pose to catch you fish just like that one on these addicted tail-out twitchers. It's a great method. It's absolutely a blast to use, and it works really, really well. All right, everybody, let's send him home. Thank you so much, little girl. Thank you so much for joining us today, you guys. We hope you learned a lot about how to use these twitching jigs and that you can take this stuff you learned today and go out and have more fun on the water. If you guys want to see more awesome tutorials just like this one, go up here and click this link to this next video. Go down here and subscribe. Make sure to turn those bells on. Give us a thumbs up if you like this video, and be sure to comment below and you can be the comment of the day just like this person right here. Thank you so much, you guys. You stay fishy. We'll see you out there.